is a soil fertility section, of course, and so I'm gonna run through this with the highlights, and feel free to do the questions in the Q&A. So here's my update outline, going over nitrogen and phosphorus, potassium, and then sulfur and zinc, and maybe other nutrients and conditions. So dry bean is probably the oddest crop that I've ever worked with. It has 3 recommendations. Usually with a legume, you inoculate it and then you let it go, and everything is fine after that. But dry bean is interesting. It is very interesting because bean and corn, teosinte, originated in the same state in Mexico, and my gut tells me that it must have been an extremely fertile environment where symbiotic nitrogen fixation really wasn't all that important in order for the plant to complete its life cycle and make seed and offspring. And so that genetic baggage comes along with it, because the inoculation with its rhizobia is very inconsistent. If it's too wet, too dry, too hot, too cold, too much soil salt, the nodulation is not very good. And so a lot of growers don't do that at all. But some growers are very successful with it. These are really exciting nitrogen rate trials on pinto beans, and the response curve, which is, this is what I mean, this is with no inoculation, that is what we call very shallow. I mean, the response return to nitrogen of that is what, $50 an acre, something like that. And the economic optimum rate is, somewhere around what, 70, 75, 80, something like that. Where there were inoculated trials, that the dollars that you spend, it really wasn't. And this was in a site, these were sites that the inoculation actually took. We did some of these studies at Carrington, some of them up by Crookston. None of them had excessive salts and those kind of stresses. So that's, if you have inoculation, there's no, and it's working good for you, there's really no reason to put on some nitrogen. So that leaves us with 3 possible strategies, and I've been in fields where all of these have been successful. You can do nothing. The reason I'm putting that up there is that I was given a talk up near Fessenden, Finley, up in that area, and a farmer that had been growing pinto beans for a very long time said, we don't need any of that stuff. And I just kind of looked at him. He says, come on, let's go to my farm. So after the field tour was over, went to his farm, and it was incredible soil. It was kind of a wettish year, but you could go out in the field and you could put your hand up to almost to your elbow in the soil and just lift out a dry bean plant. And it was just covered with nodules. He says, I haven't inoculated this field or any of my fields for 20 years. And they grow great. I mean, there must have been 200 nodules before I stopped counting on the plants. And so if you're in an area like that, you've been in dry bean rotation for quite a while, and you don't really have any stresses out there in the field, if you have some really pristine soils like they have up by St. Thomas and in this field down by Fessenden, you don't have to do anything. And then there are fields that respond really well to inoculation, and if that works for you, go for it. And if you have fields that have stresses and have salts and have wet and have dry and all that stuff, then feel free to fertilize up to 70 pounds of N, less your soil test N. And I know some people go up to 100, and that's okay. There's a plus or minus on all of this stuff, whether I tell you in a written literature or not. They're not numbers chiseled on some temple wall someplace. So if you feel that you need up to 100 pounds, I mean, go for it. With the upright varieties that we have right now, we don't have the risks of white mold like we did before. You still have to watch it, as you'll find out in your presentations later on today, but it's not quite the same as having all those bean vines laying all over the place, restricting the evaporation and collecting dew and getting into trouble. So yeah, but 70 pounds, you could probably grow over 3,000 pounds with 70 pounds. All right, so that's the nitrogen. It's not a great responder to phosphorus either. These are our recommendations for it. And frankly, once you get above the medium range, the chances of having much of a yield response from adding phosphorus is probably very, very low. So I borrow these slides from Greg Endress. That's why they're so cute and they kind of roll by. I don't do that kind of thing, but Greg's good at it. So he had a number of studies, and I'll share some data with you, where they put on 2.5 gallon of 1034O, and then they dilute it a little bit because, as you know, 1034O is pretty viscous. And so putting a little water in it makes it a better stream than glogging around with 2.5 gallon of very viscous materials. So this worked really well, as you'll find in the next data. But when they did it in a really dry spring, what was that, 2 springs ago? They had a yield reduction. So that's the caveat to this. If this spring doesn't look like it's going to be a dry spring, but you never know. This is North Dakota, Minnesota, so anything can happen. So but if it's a moist spring, and if you want to go ahead and put some fertilizer on with the seed, you can go up to 2.5 gallon of just about anything, any kind of phosphate fertilizer anyway, and you're going to be okay. But if you're planting into a dry seed bed, don't do it. That's the thing. Don't do it if it's dry. So these are some data that I teased you with a minute ago. The in-furrow and the band was better. Figures over there on the left-hand side in hundredweight per acre. These are on 5 to 10 ppm, which are low to medium soil tests, and the rates of 1034O. These are means of 3 to 6 gallon per acre, depending on what the year was. And this is some more data in furrow and band. Gave a better yield increase in these years than the untreated check and the broadcast rate as well. And they used various rates of phosphate to get to those points. But in 2021, very dry spring, significantly decreased the yield. So just do this in moist seed beds, not when it's dry. So dry beans are definitely not a big user. Well, they use some, but they're not restricted by a lot of our soil test values. So if you have soil tests of K greater than 80 part per million, that's really a non-factor. If you have soil tests lower than that, then 50 pounds of K2O, that's around 80 pounds of product, 0060. If you have 41 to 80 ppm, then maybe somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 pounds or so of K2O, but it's not a huge thing. Our zinc recommendations are based on soil tests. The extraction we use is DDPA. And if you have values below 1 ppm, a small rate of zinc in the starter would alleviate any deficiency. So if you're in a moist seed bed and you're putting on some starter with the seed, you can go ahead and put a little bit, maybe a pint to a quart. That's usually, well, it's always sufficient. I've never seen when it wasn't. And I prefer the strong chelates like the EDTA. Zinc chelate is a very good chelate. There's, I don't know, 20 different kinds of chelates out there, and some of them chelate more and less. The EDTAs tend to be a little bit more compatible with starter fertilizer. So if you're going to go that route, you need to make sure that you have a jar test to make sure you don't have peanut butter by the time you get to the end of the field, because that's kind of a pain when you're trying to get a lot planted. It's a pain when you're not planting a lot. So make sure you do the jar test, save you a world of hurt before you get going. If it is a dry seed bed, you still need the zinc. Just put it in with water and go with that. So the next nutrient I want to talk about is the sulfur. Our soils have some sulfur, and they're certainly variable in sulfur across the field. What we see over here is in 2000, over on the left-hand side, that was what, 22 years ago. You see a lot of brown in the east. You see a lot of yellow. You even see a lot of, some yellow here in North Dakota. We've always been kind of low as far as atmospheric deposition of sulfur goes. But in both of those slides, you can see the coal plant in Saskatchewan, north of Crosby, in the northwest corner of the state. You can see the plumes from the coal plants north of Bismarck. Even in the 2000 data, you can even see the plumes from the American Crystal factories over on the eastern part of North Dakota. So even at that fairly low levels, but in our latest sulfur deposition, we're only getting maybe 2 pounds or so of sulfur deposited by the atmosphere, and that's a big change from 20 years ago when we had probably closer to 10. So, and our crop yields are better right now than they were before. And so for our grassy crops, corn and small grains, and always canola, because that's just a special animal for some reason, sulfur is very, very necessary. But for our broadleaf crops, not nearly so much. So certainly I would not rely on our sulfur soil test. It's garbage, and so don't even bother. It's not diagnostic. So your sulfur response is going to be more on your sandy soils. Let's say if you're farming on the outside of the valley, you're farming some more villa soils, west of Grand Forks, and in that inner beach area, you're farming some soils in the west that may or may not be irrigated, that tend to be sandy, and you've had a lot of snow melt, you've had some spring rains. Maybe it's not a bad idea to include that with some, but don't put it with the seed. Don't do that. Ammonium thiosulfate is the most common liquid fertilizer that contains sulfur, and it has lots of good qualities, but its really bad quality is it's really, really hard on the seed. So never put it with a starter fertilizer. So if you're going to need it, it's going to broadcast. So that's a pain. So what would I do? I mean, you try to avoid any expense that you want to, and it's probably pretty well. I know it's unusual to have a whole field that's going to be sulfur responsive with dry beans. So I think what I would do is I would let the crop grow, let it get a trifoliate or two. If you have some areas out in the field, maybe the more eroded areas, maybe the sandier areas, that look a little pale, go out and take a look and make sure that it's not some kind of random chlorosis and not something else. And take a plant sample from a green area of the field that's okay. In a yellow area, confirm it's sulfur, and then just go over the top with some ammonium sulfate. And maybe on a quarter section, you maybe go over 10 acres of the 160. So you've saved a lot. Dry beans are a crop that makes their crop later in the season. You can abuse it a little bit early in the season, and it doesn't really care, somewhat like soybeans, but not quite so much. But you can treat the areas that are affected and not the whole field. So that's what I would recommend. All right. So the foliar products. So with the zinc, I would rather see a person put it on at planting time, but if you do see some problems, and people have been fertilizing for zinc in the dry bean areas so much that chances are you probably won't see any problems. But in case you do see some problems, which would be stunted plants, bronzing in the leaves, that kind of thing, in more eroded areas, again, because the source of a lot of micronutrients is the organic matter itself. So you can get a little bit of bump from a foliar application and rescue the plant. But there's some evidence that from the Carrington research that maybe some sulfur is a good idea too. So this is putting on sulfur later on the season, and this is the foliar sources, but I don't think it has to be a foliar sources. They tend to be pretty expensive, and you could just go ahead with a dry applicator. There's some around, and maybe you have some on your own farm too, or you can stream between the rows or whatever you want to do. But when your sulfur is sufficient, the foliar sources can certainly increase the yield some. And here's another one where the zinc and the sulfur together are given better yields than just the foliar zinc itself, and probably about the same yields as what the in-furrow starter fertilizer and zinc are. All right, so the last thing I'm going to talk about before I field some questions is the salinity issue. So there's a lot of fields in North Dakota, almost every one, that have some area of the field that has some pretty high salts. And so a goal of farming those areas and managing the soils is to try to get rid of those areas over time through judicious crop use, using crops that actually grow in those places instead of them being a continuous perennial fallow. This is some work that we probably need to do in the state, but this is data from Colorado from a colleague I have out there, Jessica Davis, and I think it's pretty, I've seen it here, so I know the same kind of issue happens here. So once you get to about a soil EC of 2, which isn't all that uncommon on edge of the fields and around potholes and things, your yield potential is less than half of what it was if your EC was below 1. And once it gets to 3, forget it. It's just bare. It's just going to be bare. So field selection or partial field selection, nobody wants to cut a quarter up, but you know, for crying out loud, if the 20 acres alongside the road is just going to be bare, I mean, why in the world are you spending all the money to plant it and go through the trouble? Put something else out there that's going to grow. Put some wheat, put some barley, put some oats, put something out there that's more salt resistant, and get some income off of it instead of just I thought we were done with fallow, but in terms of dry beans, there are a lot of fields that have some fallow incorporated into the system. So just food for thought. And here's my contact information if you want to contact me with a question, but there may or may not be some questions from the audience, and I'll field them at this time.